Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Prella.
And my name is Janet Carr. Welcome to another episode of the Women in 3D Printing podcast. In spirit of the upcoming TIPE 3D Printing virtual conference taking place January 27 to 28th next year, 2021, we are going to be dedicating the first series to the TIPE. So you might be wondering, what is the TIPE? TIPE represents the tracks for the conference: technology, industry, people, and economics.
And as your hosts, we are so excited to share our conversations with these trailblazing women. The all-female speaker lineup we have prepared for this conference is made up of women that have carved their careers in additive manufacturing and have inspired all of us. We can't wait to introduce them to you so you can get to know them before the conference.
So we invite you to hit that subscribe button, follow us on LinkedIn, and get to know the stories of these awe-inspiring women before the event.
We'd also like to give a shout out to our platinum sponsors, HP, Trumpf, Matter Hackers, GE Additive, and Dassault for making all of this even possible.
What launched your career into additive manufacturing?
So I was actually working in corporate development in a different industry, and I got an offer to join Stratasys. There were some people who worked in my previous company who moved there. I wasn't too familiar with 3D printing beforehand, and the more I learned about the technology and the potential to disrupt manufacturing, it just got really excited and decided I want to be a part of it and joined Stratasys. Right now, 3D printing is kind of relatively still a small industry, so I knew some people in recruiting in the domain. I really was excited about the opportunity in Xerox because I thought that a lot of the challenges that I saw, in the earlier days of my career in 3D printing, I really thought Xerox is well positioned to solve them. So when I got the offer from Xerox, it was a very easy decision.
I'm really curious, what was the challenge that you think was missing that Xerox could solve?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of the technology and the business side. Firstly, on the technology side, the industry really grew from prototyping. To move into production, you really have to make exponential improvements on the reliability and repeatability and quality. And not just have the quality, but how do you have quality assurance and show to customers the quality? Software workflows, again, in production environments are immensely different than prototyping. From design to simulation, documentation, everything needed to be improved. So I think kind of the first thing was really on the technology side, and the liquid metal technology that Xerox has, I really think represents significant improvement to what's out there. But of no less importance than the technology, I really think it's the business side. If you're going to use 3D printing in production environments, you need a service level agreement that represents production standards. You need global service coverage. You need vendor reliability, because I think most of the industry are pure 3D printing players and a lot of startups. These are things that Xerox is really well positioned to do. And actually, kind of as a side note, there are a few accounts where Xerox has managed 2D print services that actually asked us, hey, can you also service my 3D printers, non-Xerox 3D printers? And we're doing that because there is this gap in the industry. So I think, again, both the technology with the liquid metal and the software that's coming out of Park, but also the business side around the services and the global coverage.
And were you always very focused on the business side for additive manufacturing? Did you also come from a technical background?
I don't come from a technical background. I've spent my whole career in the business side, strategy, corporate development, product. So that's really my background. By the way, I'm obviously biased, but I think that business side is a lot of what's missing in the 3D printing industry today. So I think there's, to the point that I was making before, I think there's a lot of thinking and a lot of effort and a lot of investment in the technology side, which is critical. But I don't think there's enough concern about, the user experience and the workflows and making it easy for them to integrate it into existing efforts and thinking about the economics of 3D printing. So I think, that business side doesn't get enough attention. And, that's where I come in.
Yeah, there's a couple of speakers that we were interviewing during the podcast, and they mentioned, we've got a lot of great technologists, but not enough people thinking about the business case and how to position and generate that leadership buy-in internally. If someone were to, let's say, bringing 3D printing into their organization and they're new to it, what would be some tips that you'd offer them?
To really make use of all the 3D printing benefits, you do have to think about things differently. And it starts in the design process, right? So 3D printing complexity is free, and you can make geometries that weren't possible before. Don't take, the CAD file that you have for your current part that you're making in conventional manufacturing and say, let's try to 3D print it. What you want to do is obviously optimize it for additive, reduce weight. You can actually reduce weight and improve mechanical properties at the same time and reduce material waste. And actually don't even do that on the part level, do it on the assembly level, right? There's quite a few case studies online about companies who took a 50-part assembly from 15 different vendors and reduced it all the way to just, one part that they can produce. That impact is massive. And I think that's the other point, right? You have to think about things differently in the design and the engineering side of the house, but you also have to think about things differently in the business side of the house of, what is the value? Don't just compare, cost, the cost to print the part. Compare all the additional costs that you have above it, all the overheads. Like, how much does it cost you to manage those 15 suppliers and warehouse and inventory 70 different parts? Like, all these hidden fees that nobody quantifies in the UMC, in the unit manufacturing cost, they're massive and they rack up really fast. So I think to make the most of 3D printing, you have to think about all these things.
Yeah, I was at a conference right before the pandemic, and I think it was Melissa Orme from Boeing that was speaking, and she mentioned she had this beautiful graph that showcases the entire process for additive with blocks for each part. So each block represented each process and step. And so there's, design, then there's a couple blocks for production, but the post-production side was just enormous. It was like, if you're looking at this as a startup graph, that looked like a hockey stick of cost.
Absolutely. And, it's actually really interesting. And I think that's one of the unique things about Xerox, Xerox, regardless of 3D printing, is, a giant company with manufacturing operations. And I see it now. We decided to be our own customer number one. So, whatever we do in 3D printing, Xerox is our first customer. And you really see, how we're adjusting our thinking internally, right? We're forcing them, kind of to quantify not just the UMC, but all those hidden fees, which again can really turn the equation in favor of 3D printing in some parts.
Let's move on to a different question. What are some of the challenges that you've experienced, either being a woman in 3D printing or technical or business challenges of additive, that you're currently looking to overcome?
I think in terms of challenges getting into a new industry, and it doesn't matter what your background is, technical, business, it's always that kind of learning curve. And then whatever side of the house you're in, the technical or the business, you have to know the other side really well, which in my case was understanding 3D printing and the technology and everything associated with it. So I think that's always a challenge, and the best way is really just dive head first, read everything that you can, and never be, shy to ask for help. When I was starting in Stratasys 6 or 7 years ago, spent a lot of time with the engineers and a lot of time with R&D, and ask a lot of what was probably very basic, stupid questions. That's the only way to learn. I wouldn't say so much a challenge, but early on mistake would probably be that, when I joined the industry, the hype cycle was starting. 3D printing is going to replace everything. And I too got sucked into the hype cycle, and like we knew the shortcomings in some areas around the technology, around the business side that I was mentioning before, but we were overly optimistic in our ability to overcome them, but also we were over optimistic in our customers' willingness to accept them. We just thought, oh, this is so revolutionary, they're just going to live with those disadvantages. That's not the case. They're making parts today. Cars are in the roads, airplanes are not these days, but generally up in the air. Having a revolutionary technology is not enough. You have to give them something really better than what they have and not create a host of new problems. So I think kind of being overly optimistic in the beginning of the road was definitely a major learning point for me.
Know what your customers need instead of following the hype.
Yeah, listen to your customers. Yeah, that's a big one.
When you're learning a new industry, what are different factors that you think someone should look at to start learning and grasping before mobilizing their efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's always about talking to people from that industry. By the way, even when I am in that industry and I was considering different roles, I was in corporate development, then I was in product, now I'm in general management. I always talk to people who are in these industries or in these roles and try to learn as much as possible. And I think what's always really nice is, by and large, most people are very open, very willing to share and answer questions. So my best advice for people considering this industry would just be to reach out and ask and try to learn as much as you can.
Have you ever had some formal mentorship program? How did you build up that confidence? This is where you want to head towards. Just curious if there's anyone that helped you on the way.
I was very fortunate, actually. I went to INSEAD business school in France and Singapore, where I got my MBA, and the network of alumni is very, very tight. In fact, my first boss and strategist who hired me was an alumni of the same school, and that's how we kind of became acquainted as well through the network. So it's a great network that I tapped into, and hey, who can help with this? Who knows about 3D printing? Who knows about this? But I'm sure everybody else has their own networks from schools, past job places, military, what have you. So I think it's just about not being shy, just going into the network. It's so easy to find those people on LinkedIn. Right? You search for 3D printing and went to the same school as me, and just don't be shy, reach out.
Given your experience, have you had any failures or lessons learned that you can share with our community?
I won't overshare on the failures, but no, but I alluded to that before. I think the biggest failure for me, I would say, like most people in the industry, 7 years ago, I got into the hype cycle and ignoring some kind of red flags around the quality, the reliability, the ease of use, because again, we thought the technology is so exciting that everything else will fall into place. And again, I think that doesn't happen. So when you're doing that, you really have to not just think about the wizardry of the technology, but also on the dependability of your offering. And you have to build everything around it. The software workflows, the services ecosystem, all these pieces have to be thought of. And I think not appreciating the importance of that earlier on in my 3D printing career was, probably the biggest mistake.
Thank you for reiterating that. That's an important lesson. That seems to be a foundation for how you're scaling up probably Xerox.
It's all about what you learn from your mistakes, and this is exactly what we're doing differently. We're really trying to think about the whole thing. And as I was saying before, I think the critical factor is, because we're our own customer one, and believe me, we don't get any discounts from Xerox manufacturing. That really forces us to think about everything. And every time they say, oh, but what about this and what about that, we go back, we solve for it. And then that allows us to actually come up with a real, end-to-end solution.
You mentioned something about a lot of companies might not have the budget capabilities or the educational know-how. What do you think we need to do as an industry to overcome some of these human resource challenges?
You look at a lot of universities, there's courses in additive manufacturing. So I think the new generation of engineers coming to the workplaces have had experience with 3D printing. As far as the people already in the workforce who didn't gain exposure to that, I think it's about companies to provide that continuous training, make sure that their people get exposed to new technologies, new tool sets, invest in the required software and everything around it. You're seeing companies that are doing that, and not everybody though, and I would encourage more companies to do that.
Speaking of things that folks should do, what are future developments you're excited about in additive manufacturing that everyone should be on the lookout for?
There's a lot. On the hardware front, we're seeing continuous new technologies, but also improvements to existing technologies. So all those things that I was mentioning before, the reliability, the repeatability, the quality, you're seeing a lot of improvements there. For me, though, the more interesting developments will be around the software workflows and how kind of acknowledging that 3D printing isn't going to be 100% of the manufacturing pie. It's going to live side by side traditional manufacturing. So with that in mind, how do you make it easy and economical for the customer to integrate 3D printing into their manufacturing operations and see where and kind of easily identify where 3D printing makes sense and adds the most value. So I think, when we're talking about 3D printing as a solver for supply chain resiliency, I think software will play a very dominant role in that.
And are there certain types of software systems or the functionality of software that is more important to look at first? Because it's hard to take everything in, right? Because you've got design, simulations, topology optimization, workflow, forecasting. There's just so much under the sun. How do you even start?
To your point, software is a very wide term. And again, I'm constantly kind of alluding to those two fronts, the technology and the business side. So there's a software workflow on the technology side, which is all about the design optimization, all the printer management and the nesting and topology optimization and what have you, and obviously simulation and quality. But there's also, again, the business side of how do you make it easy for the supply chain and manufacturing to really identify where 3D printing makes sense. What's the right tipping point between conventional and 3D printing? How do I have 3D printing for some parts as my default? But for some parts, maybe not as my default, but as my business continuity, disaster recovery, when I cannot get that part that I need because of COVID or trade wars or what have you, and I need it now, so I will 3D print it. So I think that side of the equation is something we're going to be looking at, and actually you're seeing a lot of startups looking into that as well. So I think that's very exciting.
We are also living in very interesting times, which have definitely propelled these conversations. So let's say if you wanted to get into additive manufacturing, 3D printing, what are 3 tips you'd give?
So, the first thing is to understand that 3D printing additive manufacturing is a very large overarching term, right? You have hardware, software, materials, services, you have the technology side and the business side, small startups, the Fortune 500s. What are you most passionate about? Where do you want to focus your energy? And then zoom in on that. Second thing is really gaining that deep familiarity with the industry. So keeping up with recent news. There's a lot of websites around 3D printing, 3dprintingindustry.com to name one. Follow and learn about the industry. There's also some really great books to get familiarized. I read a few months ago, The Pan-Industrial Revolution, which I think is a phenomenal read. I think just reading a lot about the industry and learning about it. And lastly, as I was saying, is just getting in touch with people. You have LinkedIn. It's very easy to find people in the roles you're interested in the industry you're interested in, and don't be shy to reach out and ask for help.
Awesome. So if someone wants to ask you for help, how would they reach you?
LinkedIn, of course. Easiest way to find me.
Perfect. So you can find Tali on LinkedIn, or you can also find her at the upcoming TIPE 2-day virtual Women in 3D Printing Conference, January 27, 28, 2021. Thanks so much, Tali, for joining the virtual podcast and sharing your perspective.
Yeah, please and thank you.